Welcome to Digital Photography 101. This is part 2. In part 1, we discussed some basic settings on the camera, in addition to ISO. In part 2, we will discuss aperture and shutter speed. Aperture, simplified, is the opening in the lens. The larger the opening, the more light the camera gets to the sensor. But what continues to confuse many beginners is the larger the number set in the aperture means a smaller opening. With an aperture of f/22, the photo on the left lets less light into the camera. And with an aperture of f/2.8, the photo on the right lets more light into the camera. Notice the one on the right has a very shallow depth of field, where the one on the left has a deep depth of field. Aperture is also referred to as f-stop. Here are some typical f-stop or aperture settings on a DSLR camera. Notice how wide the lens opens at f/2.8 and how narrow that opening is at f/22. Aperture or f-stop settings showing in 1/3 stops in this chart. Full stops are all boxed. So it goes from f/1.8, 2.0 is a full stop, 2.2, 2.5, 2.8 is a full stop. Remember, this setting controls depth of field. Depth of field is what is in focus in your photograph. If you want everything in focus, an aperture setting of f11 to f/22 is best. Here's an example. Notice how everything up close is in focus, and even everything in the distance is also in focus. This was shot with an aperture of f/18. This photo was shot with an aperture of f/20. Once again, everything is in focus. Now let's see the opposite effect. Does anyone want to guess the aperture here? Really? Here's another example. Here's a shot of a large depth of field. Everything is in focus at f/22, but notice what happens when we go to the opposite end of the spectrum. This was shot at f/1.8. Now do you understand how important this setting is? When you set your DSLR camera on the manual setting, you will need to learn how to balance ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. There is also an aperture priority setting. On the Nikon, this is A, while on Canon, it is AV. When we select this setting, we set the aperture, and the camera will adjust the shutter speed to match our aperture setting. Now let's go to shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long the lens remains open, while aperture, on the other hand, was how wide the lens remained opened. Shutter speed is expressed in seconds, or most often, fractions of seconds. Here are some of those shutter speeds. 2, 1, 1/2, 1/4. We would read those as 2 seconds, 1 second, 1/2 of a second, all the way down to 1/4000th of a second and 1/8000th of a second. Do you see how this works? When shooting in manual, The shutter speed and the aperture must be balanced based on the amount of available light. First, we must decide what is most important. If we were taking photos at a baseball game, for example, we might need to first select our shutter speed to freeze the motion of the batter's bat while swinging. Let's say 1/4000th of a second. Next, when looking through the viewfinder, we will need to balance that setting with the aperture. This would have to be f5 or below on a sunny day. Let's become familiar with our exposure meters. Here is an example of an exposure meter on the viewfinder of a Nikon. Notice it's in the manual setting. The shutter speed is 1/200th of a second. The aperture is f4.5. And finally, the ISO is at 100. Here's that in a Canon. We need to change the aperture or the shutter speed until the yellow arrow that is now on number 1 is in the center. We do this simply by changing either the aperture or the shutter speed. Finally, here is a shutter speed cheat sheet. There is also a shutter speed priority setting. On a Nikon, this is an S. While on a Canon, this is TV. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but it stands for time value. In our next video, we will discuss light, composition, and motion.